In 100 days, nearly 1 million people were executed with machetes. Rwanda, a small country in Central East Africa, suddenly became a living hell. The killers were not soldiers, nor did they have any authority. The victims had committed no crimes. They were even neighbors, classmates, or sometimes relatives of the killers. What's more frightening is that during those 100 days, the whole world knew, but lay low. But why? Imagine you are a Hutu person. You were born in Rwanda. Your family works as farmers, like most Hutu people in your village. In Rwanda, your Hutu ethnic group makes up about 85% of the total population. But on the other side of the hill, there is another group. They're called the Tutsi. They are a minority, about 14 to 16% of the population, living in higher areas and raising cattle for a living. Besides Hutu and Tutsi, your country also comprises the Hwa ethnic group. However, they account for less than 1% of the population, so we'll leave them out for now to keep the story more comprehensible. In traditional Rwandan society, cattle are not just property. They're also a measure of status and power. The more cows a person has, the more respected they are, and the more influence they have. Because of this, Tutsi people often became advisors, village chiefs, or people who handled rituals and made judgments. But there was never a strict line between the two largest ethnic groups in Rwanda. A Hutu like you, if you became successful and saved enough cattle, could gain the same status as a Tutsi. On the other hand, a Tutsi who lost everything would have the same social level as a Hutu. This flexible class system had existed for centuries in Rwanda. Nothing could permanently define you. Everything changed depending on your situation, cattle, and role in the community. But after World War I, Rwanda became a colony of Belgium, and then everything you knew started to change. The Belgians didn't care about the flexible system of the local society. They brought a strict system of control based on Western racial theories. At that time, physical anthropology was a trendy science. It claimed that people could be grouped by body features, and the Belgians were heavily affected by this. They looked at the Tutsi and believed their height and delicate faces showed their origin from the Horn of Africa, or may even be related to the white Hamitic blood. Hutu people, being shorter, were seen as more local, primitive, and even less civilized. And just like that, what the Belgians called genetic differences slowly destroyed the social flexibility between the two groups. You could see this happening every day. In the 1930s, the Belgian government introduced ID cards. It clearly stated whether you were a Hutu or a Tutsi. If you were Hutu, you no longer had a chance to enter higher education. You could not become a village chief or be allowed to hold any power. Even if you managed to become rich, the ID card would stay the same. Meanwhile, the Tutsi received full favor. They were accepted into missionary schools, trained for leadership, and appointed to high-level government positions. The Belgians granted full political power to this minority group. An iron curtain began to form between the two ethnicities. The anger didn't explode right away, but it kept growing year after year. Not until the late 1950s did all of Africa begin to rise up. Countries in the region announced independence, one after another. The United Nations pressured European countries to return independence to their colonies. Of course, Belgium did not want that. They began to think about bending the rules. If independence were to be returned, it would only be on paper. That means on documents, the country would belong to Rwanda. But in reality, power and benefits would still be held by Belgium. In this plan, giving power to the Tutsi was a risky option. Since Tutsi people had culture, education, and knowledge, Belgium feared they would demand true independence and know how to gather the world's support. So they decided to put a Hutu government in place instead. After all, Hutu people made up the majority of the population and had little political experience. Suddenly, the Hutu people were greatly favored by Belgium, and the Tutsi, they were pushed aside. Like fire in the straw, the Hutu rose immediately. In November 1959, you heard everywhere that the Hutu ethnic group was rioting, burning houses, even driving out the Tutsi. They called it a social revolution, or a peasant uprising. Within 2 years, about 330,000 Tutsi people were forced to flee the country, even those who once held high positions. The Belgian colonial government did not intervene. They stayed silent and were resigned to the change. The United Nations stepped in. They called for elections, monitored the transfer of power, and aimed to help Rwanda become fully independent by 1962. In 1960 local elections, and also the 1961 legislative election, the Hutu won by a large margin. On July 1st, 1962, Rwanda officially became independent. The Hutu took full control of the country. For your ethnic group, it was a historic victory. You believed this was the first time Hutu people like you truly ruled the country. People celebrated. Flags and flowers turned streets into colorful canvases. But those canvases were also stained with the red blood of the Tutsi. More than 300,000 Tutsi left Rwanda during that period to neighboring countries like Uganda, Burundi, and Zaire, today's DR Congo. Yet among the refugee chaos, a new army began to form from the call of young Tutsi men. They named this army the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF. This force declared they would fight to return to their homeland. But tension did not stop there. After gaining power, the Hutu government began to remove Tutsi from all important positions. Even university doors were closed to them. Meanwhile, Tutsi exiles, particularly in Uganda, began orchestrating attacks into Rwanda. Their ultimate goal was singular: to return and seize power. Blindsided by this, the Hutu government responded with bloody crackdowns. In 1963, approximately 10,000 to 14,000 Tutsi people in Rwanda were killed in retaliation. And since then, whenever conflict arose, the government claimed the Tutsi were a threat, urging Hutu people to stay vigilant. Gradually, everyone believed that the Hutu were past victims and the Tutsi were the oppressors. If they did not unite, they would be crushed again. Any dissents were labeled traitors. You remembered clearly how Radio Télévision Libre des Mille Collines was on every single day, just relentlessly branding Tutsis as cockroaches, as parasites, as a threat that needed to be exterminated. They even went as far as to name specific individuals and their locations, claiming these were traitors who needed to be dealt with. You also saw the Kangura newspaper given free everywhere. It printed articles urging Hutu to be alert and cut all ties with Tutsi. They printed the 10 Hutu commandments and distributed them in schools. You saw students learn those by heart. Do not marry a Tutsi. Do not trade with Tutsi. Do not trust Tutsi. These messages repeated so much that people began to believe them. In this way, the Hutu government steadily strengthened its power. They controlled the media. They rewrote history in a way that favored themselves. But the fateful turning point was April 6, 1994. That day, you heard the president's plane was shot down on its way back from the peace talks with the RPF rebel group. In the eyes of many extremist Hutus, this assassination proved that the Tutsi and RPF were an intolerable threat. The animosity between the two ethnic groups now escalated into a fight to the death. Either you kill them, or they kill you. So, within hours, checkpoints were set up at every intersection. You saw people forced to show identity cards stating their ethnic group. Anyone labeled as Tutsi was pulled out and killed on the spot. Then there were the house-to-house huntings. They knocked down doors, carried machetes, and massacred Tutsi people. Many families died inside their homes. Anyone who spoke up to protect Tutsi was seen as a traitor. Women were raped and killed. Children were slaughtered in front of their mothers. Some people were denounced by their own children for hiding Tutsi. But what you were wondering is, why did the killing go on for months with no one stopping it? A nationwide massacre should have drawn international attention, just like what happened in Yugoslavia. But even the United Nations seemed calm. Perhaps you need to review the question. It's not when will they intervene, but on what conditions. The answer is usually when they have something to gain. It might be oil, minerals, strategic location, or political influence. Sometimes, it's just money, weapons, or contracts. If there's nothing to gain, nobody wants to meddle. Because basically, only the Security Council can authorize intervention, and the Security Council is controlled by the great powers. So what does Rwanda have? Rwanda is a small, impoverished country with an agriculture-based economy. It does not have oil, gas, or large-scale minerals like gold or diamonds. Its main earnings come from coffee, tea, and tourism. Rwanda lies deep inside Central Africa. It is landlocked and far from trade routes. Therefore, it's understandable that countries hesitated, even refused to send troops. Moreover, each power had its own reason. Specifically, the United Nations was present in Rwanda, but was short on personnel and authority. Even after the massacre began, instead of adding troops, they were cut from over 2,500 to fewer than 300. The UN Secretary General admitted that it was hard to get member states to send soldiers to Rwanda, and he could not force any country to do so. During the bloodiest phase, the UN was powerless. The United States, on the other hand, had just received a major lesson from the Black Hawk Down event. 18 American soldiers died and more than 70 were injured when they entered Somalia under UN calls. Images of American bodies dragged through the streets shocked public opinion in the US. That event made the Clinton administration cautious about any military intervention in Africa. They even avoided the word genocide in Rwanda to avoid legal obligations under the UN Genocide Convention. Other Western countries like Belgium, Britain, or Canada mostly just spoke out or withdrew troops. Belgium pulled all its peacemakers after 10 of its soldiers were killed. Meanwhile, human rights groups and independent journalists reported early about the genocide. But the mainstream media framed it as a normal civil war between two opposing groups, obscuring the scale and horror of the massacre from the public. There was one country that did not remain silent, yet their action only made things worse. In the early 1970s, France began close involvement with the Hutu government in Rwanda. They sent military advisors, trained troops, gave weapons, and kept personal ties with those in power. Because of this, they built a French-speaking Rwanda under their influence and adopted the French currency. France saw Rwanda as a stronghold against the rising influence of English-speaking countries like Uganda. When the genocide broke out, France immediately sided with the Hutu government. They saw the RPF as a threat not only in terms of military force, but also because it was aligned with the UK and the US, English-speaking, and originated from Uganda. In the view of French policymakers, if RPF won, Rwanda might fall under US or British influence. Therefore, even before the genocide began, France had prepared support for the Hutu side. The Rwandan army, which once had fewer than 10,000 soldiers, grew to over 30,000 with French weapons and training. Many of those trained later participated in the genocide. This created a bloody picture that still stains a corner of Africa today. The massacre only ended when the Rwandan Patriotic Front entered the capital and overthrew the Hutu government. The killing forces, who used to walk arrogantly on the streets, now collapsed in chaos. Hundreds of thousands of murderers ran in panic toward the Zaire border. France, under the authority of the Security Council, launched Operation Turquoise in Rwanda in the name of humanitarian support. However, much evidence shows that this operation was actually to help the genocide perpetrators escape to Zaire. There, they built refugee camps, which were in fact armed bases. They were allowed to bring weapons, keep the old army, and even organize training. But not only the ruthless killers had to flee, even gentle Hutu people like you also had to run away, because of the fear of revenge. The blood had stopped flowing, but nearly 1 million people had died, most of them Tutsi. They died only because their ethnic group was written clearly on their ID cards. Moderate Hutu people who refused to hold a machete or dared to protect neighbors were not spared either. On average, more than 300 people died every hour. About 15,700 rape cases were officially recorded, but the actual number may be much higher. A significant number of the perpetrators had HIV. They intentionally spread the disease as a form of biological genocide. Many pregnant women were raped to death. The children born from these rapes were called children of the enemy. However, the consequences of the genocide did not stop there. By 1996, the Tutsi army entered Zaire and attacked the refugee camps. That event led to a series of complex conflicts, starting what was called the First Congo War. The second one broke out from 1998 to 2002. Countries in the region like Uganda, Angola, Zimbabwe, and South Africa all got involved. Almost 9 countries joined the war. More than 20 armed groups were active. turning this into the African World War. The result was even more terrifying, with over 5.4 million people dying from hunger, disease, and fighting. It can be said, the Rwanda genocide did not end with peace, but opened a new cycle of instability for the whole region. After all the tragedies, finally, humanity spoke up. The first was US President Bill Clinton. In 1998, he visited Rwanda. He admitted that the US did not intervene early enough. In an interview, he said that if the US had intervened earlier, they might have saved 300,000 lives. In 2021, French President Emmanuel Macron also set foot in Rwanda's capital. He admitted that France had a big responsibility in letting the genocide happen. The Belgians also came. They were the ones who brought ID cards with ethnic labels to your country. Prime Minister Guy Verhofstadt stood before the memorial of the victims. He said, "In the name of my country, in the name of my people, I ask you for forgiveness." On the outside, the big countries seemed to be just standing and watching, but in fact, they were all racing in silence, trying to bring home the most benefits for their own countries. Human lives, or noble things like human rights that they often preach, in the end, were just things to be measured and calculated last. Rwanda, like many African countries after gaining independence in the 1960s, continued to be a pie torn apart in new geopolitical plans. So, if you're not strong enough to protect yourself, then you will forever be a chess piece in someone else's game.